Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be building Hobby Boss's 1/48 scale Su-27UB Flanker. As soon as we open the box, we can immediately see two enormous pieces of the fuselage. It's really well molded, there's plenty of surface detail, while there are a few little almost ejector pin marks that need to be sanded away later. We also have some great rubber tires and some small photo etch in construction over at the cockpit. As you can see, the detail is already great. We first start with the slight construction, which is basically just putting in the rear walls of both cockpits. As this is a two-seater jet, we will have to almost do everything twice. Here you can see us installing the second piece into place. Then we can move on to painting the cockpit. I painted the entirety of it in a coat of Tamiya light blue. This is how it looked after painting. After painting, we can move on to the cockpit decals, which are great, and it saves a lot of time with painting. I first soak the decal in water for about 10 to 15 seconds and cover the required area with Tamiya Mark Fit. I then squeeze the excess out with a cotton bud afterwards. I then started with some slight weathering, which was just Tamiya's black panel line accent color all over the cockpit. It just brings out some of the hidden details. The same decal process was then used on the instrument panels. And then I decided to spray the instrument panel covers in black. I then sprayed the joystick of both cockpits in black and added the red button details with a small toothpick. The rudders were just painted with Tamiya aluminium. Once everything was put into place, this was how the cockpit was starting to look. I also dry brushed some silver onto the instrument panel covers just for some slight weathering. We could then get started on the ejection seat. I painted the entirety of it in Tamiya matte black. Then I painted the seat cushions in Tamiya's khaki paint. I then dry brushed some silver onto the sides of the seats just to bring out a detail. You can see that over here. I then added just the little ejection seat handles in red, and that was the ejection seat done. After a clear varnish, there was the cockpit done. I then installed it into the flanker's actual body, and this is what we can see over here. Next up was taking the seam off of the canopy. I first scraped it off with an X-Acto blade. After sanding and polishing the seam, I masked up the cockpit using Tamiya's masking tape. Next up, the front wheel strut was painted in Tamiya flat white. And then I could get started on this type of wheel cover that the flanker front wheels use. I believe I sprayed it in a mixture of Tamiya aluminium and Tamiya titanium. Some of the engine details were then sprayed in advance in titanium. I painted the interior of the engines using Tamiya's buff paint and used a mixture of dark umber and black oils to streak the inside of the engines. The engine pieces were then installed into the lower half of the fuselage. I then painted the wheels in a custom dark green mixture. The front landing gear assembly was then put together. The wheel wells were then painted in what, if I remember correctly, was Tamiya light grey paint. I started with the front one, and then I did the two rear ones. The front wheel assembly was then placed into the lower half of the fuselage. Already it's time to mate the two fuselage halves together. I used Tamiya masking tape to align them, and then just used Tamiya extra thin to cement them together. The fit was great for the most part. The front part of the engine intakes were painted with Tamiya titanium. This is how the intake looked after painting the metal part. It could then be cemented to the lower half of the fuselage. I painted the rear wheel struts in white and painted the required parts using Tamiya aluminium. They were then covered in a black panel wash. Tamiya's brown panel wash was added to the wheels, and then that was cemented onto the rear wheel struts. The interior of the wheel bay doors were just painted in red. The exterior of the wheel bay doors were then painted in a lightened version of Tamiya's sky blue. I can't remember the exact measurements because I kind of just eyeballed it. An extra little detail part was glued into place. Then we could get started on a black panel wash, which I let slightly dry and then just removed the excess with a cotton bud. The same process was then applied to the other gear bay doors. I then got started with painting the nozzles. I first primed them in Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 black. They were then coated in a half-half mixture of aluminium and titanium. Once that was dry, I masked the top half of the exhaust and sprayed Tamiya's clear blue in little stripes over the bottom to simulate some of the Flanker's signature weathering. The middle part of the exhaust was then masked off and painted in titanium. I then masked the nozzle as seen here and sprayed it in Mr. Metal Color Dark Iron. The result of the dark iron can be seen here. I wasn't entirely happy with how the clear blue had come out before, so I came in for a second round just to make it slightly more obvious. After all of that was painted, I masked the top half and used some dark umber oils just to add a slight orange tint to the bottom half of the nozzle. Once that was done, I put some black oil on a sponge and just gave it some grime. This was the final result of the nozzles. Once I clear coated the nozzles, I decided to paint the inside in the exact same way I did the engines. This is the finished result of the engine nozzles. I'm quite happy with how they came out. Some interior bits for the canopy were then painted in Tamiya's flat black. Then was time to add the PE mirrors. These were a nightmare to install, but in the end I got them in alright. Now we could finally get some paint down. I painted the whole model in Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 black. The Flanker is a very large model and this took quite a lot of time and quite a lot of paint. This was how the whole model then looked after being primed. I was really satisfied with how it came out, and I thought it looked really smooth. After priming, I decided to get on going with some pre-shading using the mottling technique. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have done this, as you couldn't really see it at all through the camo that I decided to paint. This was the result of pre-shading the whole model. I then got started with painting the whole lower half of the model in that same lightened sky blue that I used for the exterior of the wheel bay doors. Although I think I did lighten it slightly more than what I painted there, but I did go back and correct the wheel bay doors later as well. This is what the whole underside looked like after painting. I was really quite satisfied with the color. I then masked off the gear bay interior and painted it in the same color that I painted it earlier, which I believe was either Tamiya light grey or Tamiya dark grey. This was how they looked after painting. I could then get started with painting the base colors for the camo. I started by painting the required areas with using Tamiya's dark blue. This was how all the dark blue sections looked like after painting. I then used a rough template of where the medium grey would go, and I painted those areas. This is what the model then looked like after painting the base colors for the camo down. I'd initially planned to hand cut the masks for the camo by myself, but after trying for a short while I realized it would be too difficult. So I ordered a set of masks. While I waited for them to arrive, I began on the ordnance. I first primed them using that Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 in black again. I then masked off the bits that I thought were going to stay black, and I sprayed the rest of it using Tamiya's white. This was a slight mistake, however, as when I looked at references I saw that the missiles were almost entirely white with some metal accents. I went back and actually corrected these later. Once the masks arrived from Foxbot, I placed them all onto the model and played an ever so slightly version of the Tamiya Sky Blue. It's a similar color to the underside, but it is slightly darker. Once the main color was sprayed on, I masked off the engine areas and started spraying them with Tamiya aluminium. Unfortunately, some of the footage got lost, but I did manage to take pictures. I first did some variation with titanium on top of that, which you can see is the darker area at the top, and then I sprayed on some of that clear blue that I used on the nozzles previously. I then masked off what I believed to be the refueling port and painted that in Tamiya's dark grey. After painting the interior of the speed brake in Mr. Hobby's interior green, I then masked off the required areas and sprayed it with Tamiya's light grey. This was how the flanker was looking at this stage of the build, and I was getting really excited and satisfied with how it looked. Now I could finally get started with the main decals. I started off by coating the area in Tamiya's Mark Fit. Once I'd soaked the decal in water for about 15 to 20 seconds, I transferred it over onto the tail area, or the main area, and then squeezed the excess out with a cotton bud. This is how the decal looked after pressing it down. It conformed really well. You can see this is the tail after all those decals had been done. After using that same process to apply decals to the rest of the model and then covering it in a matte varnish, it was time to remove the masks from the canopy. And then it was time to just glue on the final little details. Over here I was gluing on the infrared search and track part that the flankers use. And with that, the model was finished. I hope you enjoyed.